Millbrook Heights did not happen by accident. It was built the way certain people build everything, with precision, with exclusion, dressed up as aesthetics, and with the unspoken understanding that the rules existed not to protect the neighborhood, but to define it, to draw a line between the people who belonged and the people who merely arrived and were expected to understand the difference without being told. The maple trees lining Birchwood Drive had been planted exactly 22 feet apart, their branches forming a cathedral canopy overhead that turned amber and copper every November, with the kind of beauty that looked effortless and cost a fortune to maintain. The driveways were pressure washed on the first Saturday of every month. The mailboxes were painted in colors pre-approved by the Millbrook Heights Homeowners Association, a document 43 pages long that governed everything from the permitted height of garden hedges to the acceptable shades of exterior house paint, and which was enforced with the fervor of people who had confused order with meaning. Number 714 Birchwood Drive had been empty for 7 months, and in a neighborhood where nothing went unnoticed and nothing went uncommented upon, 7 months of vacancy had become a source of low-grade unease, a question that nobody had satisfactorily answered. The previous owners had sold quietly and moved to Scottsdale. Nobody knew who had bought it. The HOA had sent 2 letters to the address on file and received no response, which in Millbrook Heights was practically a declaration of war. On the front lawn near the garden bed running along the porch steps, a single marigold lay crushed and flat. A delivery truck had clipped the edge of the bed the previous afternoon, and nobody had noticed and nobody had replanted it, and it lay there in the morning frost like something small and forgotten that had not yet understood it was gone. The street was quiet. It was the quiet of a held breath. General Vivian Carter was on her knees in the soft earth of the front garden at 714 Birchwood Drive, and she was not thinking about the 23 countries she had served in, or the 4 stars currently folded inside a garment bag on the second floor of the house behind her, or the congressional briefing scheduled in 11 days, or the 3 ongoing operations she monitored twice daily through a secure device she kept on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, like a normal person keeps their phone. She was thinking about the resistance of the earth. She had forgotten, genuinely forgotten, in the way you forget something that was once so ordinary. It didn't register as precious how much she loved the specific sensation of pulling a weed from the root, that moment of tension where the soil holds on and then releases that small daily victory of patience over stubbornness. She had forgotten what it felt like to work with her hands and have the result be something living, something that would bloom in the spring and not require her to be anything other than the person who planted it. She wore canvas gardening gloves stained rust brown from years of use, worn thin at the fingertips from seasons of work, in whatever patch of earth she could find near whatever base she'd been stationed at Fort Bragg-Ramstein, a forward operating base in a country she couldn't name publicly, where she had kept a single clay pot of herbs on a concrete windowsill because she needed something alive nearby when everything around her was the opposite. She wore an oversized Howard University hoodie. The emblem on the chest faded to a suggestion of itself from countless washings, the elbows gone soft and thin. She wore army green sweatpants with a grass stain on the left knee from a gardening session at her sister's house in Virginia 3 years ago, the last time she had stayed long enough in one place to plant something she got to see grow. She had bought this house through the Carter Family Trust 7 months ago, working through attorneys while stationed overseas reviewing photographs on a secure laptop during a window between briefings, choosing a home the way a general chooses a position for its quiet, its potential, its distance from everything that required her to be General Carter. She had slept here exactly 4 nights. The house still smelled like fresh paint and possibility. The exhaustion she carried was not physical. Her body was in better condition than most people half her age maintained by decades of military fitness requirements that had become simply the way she moved through the world. The exhaustion was the other kind, the bone-deep, soul-wide tiredness that came from making decisions that affected thousands of lives day after day, year after year, in conditions that did not permit uncertainty or grief or the luxury of a single moment that belonged only to her. Sleep touched the surface of it and went no further. She was planting marigolds along the garden border because her mother, Eleanor Carter, who had raised 2 children on a schoolteacher's salary in Richmond, Virginia, and who had died the previous February while Vivian was on a transport plane somewhere over the Atlantic and could not get there in time, had always said that marigolds were the most honest flowers because they bloomed in the hardest conditions and asked for nothing in return. Her mother had kept them along every fence line of every house they had ever lived in, and Vivian had been planting them ever since, in the specific way that grief finds its way into the hands when it cannot find its way out any other direction. She pulled a weed, set it in the pile, exhaled slowly. She noticed with the peripheral awareness that 34 years of military training had made as natural as breathing that the same police cruiser had made 3 slow passes down Birchwood Drive in the last 90 minutes. Not speeding toward a call, not passing through, moving the way a shark moves through water, slow and deliberate and looking. She filed it. She kept gardening. She had learned long ago that the most useful response to a threat you cannot yet name is to stay very still and let it come to you. Carol Whitfield had been the president of the Millbrook Heights Homeowners Association for 11 consecutive years, which meant she had developed over that time a finely calibrated sensitivity to anything that deviated from the neighborhood's established order. The wrong color of Christmas lights, a hedge trimmed a 1/4 inch too high, a lawn that had yellowed during the August drought when the watering restriction memo had been clearly circulated. She walked her golden retriever Biscuit down Birchwood Drive every morning at 9:15, and she had been doing so long enough that the route had become a quiet inspection, an audit she performed with the satisfied attention of someone who genuinely believed that the small details were what held everything together. She stopped dead when she saw the woman kneeling in the garden at 7:14. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the faded hoodie, the work gloves, the total absence of any acknowledgement that she was being observed, and felt in her chest the specific discomfort of encountering someone who did not seem to register that they were being assessed, who was not performing the usual small signals of awareness. The slight upward glance, the apologetic, straightening the reflexive smile that said, "I know you're watching and I understand what that means." The woman just kept gardening, like she owned the place. Carol walked up the path. She said something about HOA mulching standards and curb appeal and how the neighborhood had a certain way of doing things that new residents sometimes needed time to understand. Her tone was the specific politeness that contains underneath it a question it never quite asks directly. Do you understand what kind of place this is? And do you understand your position in it? Vivian looked up. She said she had just moved in. She said she was getting to it. She went back to her gardening. The composure of it, the absolute refusal to be smaller, the complete absence of the deference Carol had expected and had not even consciously known she was expecting, was what undid her. She read it as aggression because she was accustomed to reading the absence of deference as aggression. She walked half a block, stopped, looked back. Vivian had not looked up. Carol pulled out her phone. "There's a woman at 714 Birchwood," she said when the line connected. "I don't think she's supposed to be there." She did not say race. She did not have to. She watched the cruiser appear at the end of the street 30 seconds later and felt arriving at the same moment relief and a wrongness she would not be able to name for months, and which would not let her sleep well until she did. Sergeant Dale Pruitt rolled onto Birchwood Drive the way he had rolled onto streets in Millbrook Heights for 22 years, slowly, with the specific confidence of a man who understood that a police cruiser moving at 10 miles per hour projected more authority than one moving at 30. He had refined presence into a weapon long ago. He no longer thought about it. It was simply how he moved. Officer Marcus Webb sat in the passenger seat 14 months on the force, scanning the scene through the windshield and finding nothing that registered as alarming a woman in a garden cold morning light, the smell of November coming through the cracked window. He frowned slightly and said nothing because he had learned in 14 months that frowning slightly and saying nothing was the safest available option when Pruitt had already made up his mind about something. Before he cut the engine, Pruitt reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small black notebook, the kind with a cardboard cover, the kind you could buy in a pack of 3 at any drugstore. He opened it to a fresh page and wrote something down in his compressed, practiced handwriting. 3 lines. He capped the pen and tucked it away. Webb had seen this before. "What are you writing?" he asked. Pruitt opened his door. "Getting ahead of the paperwork," he said. He stepped out, adjusted his belt with the habitual satisfaction of a man who had been performing this particular gesture for over 2 decades, and walked across the lawn toward the garden, not on the stone path that ran from the sidewalk to the porch steps, but directly across the border, his boot coming down squarely on the cluster of marigolds Vivian had just finished planting along the left edge of the bed, pressing 3 of them flat into the soil without breaking stride and without looking down. Vivian looked at the crushed flowers under his boot. Then she looked at his face. She set her trowel down carefully in the soil beside her knee. She had learned over 34 years to pay very close attention to men who moved through other people's spaces without looking down. "Step away from the house, ma'am." His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had long ago stopped distinguishing between asking and ordering, who had found that the space between those 2 things was where his power lived, and that maintaining it required never allowing the distinction to be questioned. Vivian stood, brushed the soil from her knees with 2 careful strokes, and turned to face him. She was nearly his height, which he noticed immediately and did not like. "Is there a problem, officer?" she said. "We got a call," Pruitt said with the ease of someone stating a conclusion rather than beginning an inquiry. "Suspicious individual. Potential trespassing." "I live here," she said. "I'm gardening. Let me see some identification." "It's inside on the kitchen counter." "I can show you the property deed on my phone, or I can go." "Don't reach for anything," he said, and his hand dropped to unsnap the retention strap on his holster, in the same motion smooth and reflexive, the gesture of a man who had learned to reach for his authority before he reached for anything else. Webb, standing a step back and to Pruitt's right, shifted his weight. "Sarge," he said carefully. She said her ID's inside. She wasn't reaching. Pruitt didn't look at him. The look that followed was the one Webb had learned to recognize in his first 3 months on the force. Not angry, not even particularly sharp, just the specific blankness of a man communicating that the conversation had already ended. Webb closed his mouth. Pruitt stepped closer, reducing the space between himself and Vivian in the way he always did when he needed to remind someone of the fundamental geometry of their situation. His size, his badge, his 22 years of institutional weight behind him. He was accustomed to people reorganizing themselves around this proximity, leaning back slightly, dropping their eyes, making themselves less. It was a physics he had relied on his entire career. Vivian didn't move. Her posture, the naturally rigid bearing of someone who had stood at attention in front of presidents and secretaries of defense, and rooms full of generals who all outranked her, and none of whom had ever made her feel small, simply declined to participate in the geometry he was offering. She met his eyes without visible effort. He didn't like it. He couldn't have named exactly why. He compensated by escalating, which was the only move his training had ever given him when the usual tools weren't working. "I've been patrolling Millbrook Heights for 22 years, he said, his voice dropping to the register he used when he wanted his words to feel like a wall. "And in 22 years I've never been wrong about who belongs and who doesn't." He said it like a compliment to himself. He said it with his shoulders loose and his voice unhurried and his eyes steady on hers, with the absolute comfort of a man who has said something so many times that it has stopped feeling like a claim and started feeling like a law of nature. Webb heard every word of it clearly at close range with his body camera running. He reached up and adjusted the angle of the lens, not to turn it off, but to make certain the framing was correct, that Pruitt's face was visible, that the audio pickup was unobstructed. He did not fully understand in that moment why he did this. He would understand later. "Am I under arrest?" Vivienne asked. Her voice was steady and precise and entirely without the tremor Pruitt was waiting for. "Trespassing, resisting failure to comply," he said, unclipping the handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around." "On what specific evidence of trespassing?" He moved. The grab was sudden and harder than necessary, his fingers closing around her bicep with the specific force of a man who needed to convert a conversation that wasn't going his way into something physical and decisive. Something that had a clear winner and a clear loser, and no more room for the wrong person to keep speaking. He twisted her wrists behind her back with rough, angular movements that were about punishment rather than procedure, and the handcuffs went on too tight, the metal edges pressing into the skin of her wrists with enough force that she could already feel the bruising forming beneath the surface. She did not resist. Every trained instinct in her body knew precisely what it would take to reverse this situation in under 3 seconds. She had been trained by people who had written the curriculum. She did not use any of it. She let him build his case against himself with every unnecessary movement, every millimeter of excessive force, every moment that Webb's camera was recording in high definition from an angle that Pruitt had not once looked at. She was not being arrested. She was collecting evidence. The hand on the top of her head as he folded her into the back seat, that particular gesture. The forced duck, the practiced submission, was one she had read about in field reports and seen documented in testimony transcripts and had always understood intellectually. Understanding it intellectually and feeling it happen to her own body were two different things, and she noted the difference with the same clinical precision she brought to everything filed it kept it. The door slammed. The specific sound of it, that particular metallic finality, settled into the air of the cruiser. Vivienne leaned back against the seat. She closed her eyes. From the sidewalk, Webb watched her through the rear window and felt the particular discomfort of a man who cannot identify what is wrong, but knows with complete certainty that something is. People who were innocent and frightened did not look like that. People who were frightened moved, pressed their palms against the glass, shifted their weight, looked for exits. She was motionless. She looked like someone who had already accounted for every variable in the next hour and had decided to let it play out. She was thinking about the GPS beacon in the secure phone in her back pocket, which had transmitted an alert to a monitoring system the moment she was moved from her property against her will. A system staffed around the clock by people with clearance levels that made Pruitt's entire institutional backing look like a hall monitor's lanyard. She was thinking about what those people were doing right now, which she knew with some precision because she had helped design the protocol. She was thinking about the small black notebook in Pruitt's breast pocket and the 3 lines he had written before he got out of the car, and what it meant that a man wrote a report before he made the arrest it described. She was thinking about 23 formal complaints filed against Dale Pruitt between 2002 and this morning, each one reviewed by Councilman Earl Mosley's office, each one quietly closed. Each one added to a file that had been growing in an FBI field office for 6 months. She looked through the rear window at the crushed marigolds in her garden. She committed the image to memory. She turned forward. She was done looking back. Pruitt radioed in as he pulled away from the curb, his voice easy and unhurried, using the careful procedural language that transformed an unjust arrest into a document suspicious individual, probable trespassing subject, non-compliant officer, safety concern. All the words were technically available to him and collectively constructed a fiction he had been constructing in one form or another for 22 years. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Vivienne, expecting to see the expression he was accustomed to seeing in that mirror. Fear, or the specific collapse of a person who has just understood what is happening to them and has no language for it. She was looking out the side window with an expression he couldn't read, and that inability lodged itself somewhere just below the surface of his awareness and stayed there itching. "This is how you maintain a neighborhood," he said to Webb, eyes back on the road. "You set the standard early. People need to understand what the expectations are." Webb said nothing. He was watching the road with his jaw tight in the specific way of a man who has a sentence sitting in his mouth and is calculating very carefully the cost of letting it out. Pruitt's phone buzzed on the center console, a text from an unsaved number. Webb caught 2 words from the corner of his eye before Pruitt's hand covered the screen and turned it face down. "Everything clean." Pruitt typed 2 letters with his thumb and slid the phone into his breast pocket next to the black notebook. Webb looked at the road. He filed it in the place where he had been filing things for 14 months. The place he had been telling himself wasn't getting too full, the place that this morning was beginning to feel like it might overflow. The Millbrook Heights police station was a squat brick building that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaning fluid and something underneath both of those things. The particular smell of a place where people had been processed and held and moved through for decades. A smell that is less a smell than a residue, less a residue than a truth about what a building has been used for. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency just below what was technically noticeable. The linoleum floor had been replaced once in 2004 in a color that had since deepened from institutional beige into something closer to old teeth. Roy Tatum sat behind the booking desk with a coffee that had stopped being hot 20 minutes ago, reading the previous day's sports section because this morning's hadn't arrived, which had been an ongoing problem for 3 weeks that he had reported twice with 0 result, and which had come to feel like several other things in his life, like a situation that was simply going to persist until it didn't. He looked up when Pruitt came in. He saw the woman. He saw the quality of her stillness, not the stillness of someone subdued, but the stillness of someone who had decided deliberately and completely to be still. He saw the posture, which was the kind that came from decades of being required to have it, and which could not be faked or borrowed. He saw her look at the room the way someone looks at a room they are going to have to account for later, methodically, without rushing. Something in his chest went quiet with unease. He had been doing this job long enough to know the difference between the people who came through the booking desk and this whatever this was, and he filed that knowledge in the same place he had been filing things for 20 years. Pruitt listed the charges with the easy shorthand of a man reciting something well rehearsed. Tatum's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Vivienne gave her address, stated her ownership of the property, offered documentation, each word placed with the precision of someone who understood that everything said in this room was potentially a court record. Pruitt cut her off. Tatum pulled up the property records. He read 3 lines. He closed the tab. He opened a new screen and began typing the booking report because that was the motion 20 years of practiced looking away had made automatic. But the 3 lines sat in the front of his mind, lit and insistent, refusing to be filed the way everything else had been filed. "She's requesting her phone call, Bryce," he said. "She can wait," Pruitt said. Tatum nodded. He kept typing. He would carry that nod, the specific weight of it, the precise moment of it, for the rest of his working life. Vivienne sat on the metal bench in the holding area with the systematic attention she brought to every unfamiliar space exits. Cameras, personnel positions, chain of command. The specific energy of a room that tells you, if you know how to read it, exactly what kind of place it is and exactly what it has been allowed to become. 2 exits beyond the booking desk. 4 cameras, 1 likely blind spot in the northeast corner. Tatum at the front desk, navigating something internal. Webb near the water cooler doing nothing in the way of a man who is thinking very hard. Officer Patricia Dunn at a corner desk filling out forms with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the safest thing she can do right now is not look up. Pruitt was at his desk composing his report. His typing was fast and confident, the speed of a man writing something he has written many times before. something that has always worked, something that has always landed in a filing cabinet and stayed there. He reached into his breast pocket without looking and set the small black notebook on the desk beside his keyboard. He glanced at it once, then began transferring what was written there into the official report. Webb from across the room watched this. His mouth tightened. Dunn's pen slowed on her form. She looked at the notebook without appearing to look at it. She looked back at her form. The pen did not speed back up. Webb's hand went to his body camera for the third time in 20 minutes. He checked the indicator light. He let his hand fall. He did not turn it off. Above Pruitt's desk, framed in black Millbrook Heights Police Department Officer of the Year 2019. Pruitt in full uniform, smiling, holding a plaque, a small American flag in a brass stand to its right. Vivienne looked at the photograph. She looked at the man currently typing his fabricated account of her morning. She looked back at the photograph. Then she looked at the clock on the wall. 9:41 a.m. She ran the calculation with the automatic precision of someone for whom logistics and timelines were as natural as breathing. From the moment her GPS beacon triggered approximately 8 minutes before the cruiser arrived, extraction protocol for her clearance level ran 22 minutes for ground units. Air support added at minute 17 from the point of confirmed distress signal. She looked at her wrists. The handcuff marks had deepened from red to purple-black, the metal edges having pressed into the skin with enough sustained force to rupture the small capillaries beneath the surface. She did not ask for ice. This bruising was evidence. She was keeping it exactly as it was, and she was going to make sure it was photographed from 6 angles before the hour was out. He came over because he couldn't help it, because 22 years of never being challenged had made the silence of someone in the holding area feel like an affront, and because the specific quality of this silence was doing something to him that he couldn't entirely account for and needed to address. He crossed the bullpen and stood in front of her with his arms folded and then crouched to her eye level in the gesture he had used 100 times, the move that said, "I'm coming down to your level," while meaning the opposite entirely, while meaning, "I want my dominance to be intimate. I want you to feel how close it is." He was accustomed to people rearranging themselves in response to this, pulling back, looking at the floor. She looked directly at him, not with hostility, with the clear, steady attention of someone doing an assessment. He talked about people who came from outside and thought a property deed was the same as belonging. He talked about the culture of a neighborhood, the history of it, the way certain things were understood by the people who had built them. He heard himself talking, and it sounded to a part of him he rarely consulted like something he said when he didn't have anything else. And then he said it fully in the exact words he had been saying for 22 years, the sentence that had always worked, the sentence that had always been the end of the conversation. "I've been the law in Millbrook Heights for 22 years, and in 22 years, I've never been wrong about who belongs and who doesn't." Webb heard it. Every syllable at close range with his body camera running and the lens adjusted to catch Pruitt's face at the correct angle. Tatum heard it from behind his desk. His hands went still on the keyboard. Dunn heard it from the corner. Her pen stopped moving entirely. Nobody said a word. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, somewhere down the block, a car alarm cycled through its sequence and stopped. Vivienne looked at Pruitt with the specific, quiet recognition she had felt on battlefields, and in situation rooms, and in the offices of men who held tremendous power and no wisdom. The recognition of watching someone reveal with perfect completeness exactly who they are and exactly what they have built their life on. "I'd like my phone call now," she said. The phone mounted on the wall near the holding area was institutional and old, a hardwired handset bolted to cinder block, its plastic receiver warm and slightly worn from years of desperate hands, its cord replaced twice. The kind of phone that connected to the outside world in the most basic possible way, with no security, no encryption, no capacity for privacy. It didn't matter. The number Vivian was about to dial did not require privacy. It required only accuracy. She dialed from memory a number that existed in no directory that was rotated on a 90-day cycle that currently lived in fewer than a dozen mines in the world, and was known to those mines because they had clearance levels that most people in this building had never heard of. She dialed it the way she dialed it every time she used it without pause, her fingers moving with the certainty of someone who has done the same thing under conditions that made this station look like a rest stop. Pruitt stood across the room with his arms folded, watching her with the patient condescension of a man who had seen this before, someone in custody reaching for a lifeline that didn't exist, performing the motions of a bluff that was already transparent. He was certain of this. He had been certain of things for 22 years, and it had always worked out. The line rang once. A voice answered, crisp and professional, sitting in a building she couldn't name publicly, in a room with 3 simultaneous secure feeds, and already on the console a priority alert that had been blinking for 19 minutes because a general-grade GPS beacon had gone mobile without scheduled authorization. Office of the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. "This is General Vivian Carter," she said, her voice steady and factual and exactly loud enough to be heard clearly by everyone within 15 feet of her. She gave the authentication code 3 words that, when entered against her biometric profile in the system on the other end of the line, unlocked a response protocol that the people in this station had no category for: Carter, Foxtrot 6, Tango Whiskey. She reported her situation in 6 sentences. No emotion. No editorializing. Location, nature of the detention name and badge number of the detaining officer, status of injuries, request for extraction and federal oversight initiation. Pure information in the cadence of a field report, because that was what it was. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. The controlled pause of someone whose training was working very hard against their genuine alarm, and then the voice shifted into something tighter, more urgent, the careful surface starting to show the pressure underneath it. Ground units had mobilized 14 minutes ago when the beacon moved. FBI field office had been notified. Agent Diana Reyes, who had been building a file on Millbrook Heights for 6 months, waiting for a predicate event that would give her legal standing to act on financial irregularities she had been tracking since April, was already in her car and already pulling onto the interstate. Do not engage further. Maintain position. Vivian set the receiver back in its cradle with deliberate care, the way you set down something that has already done what it needs to do. She turned around. Pruitt was still watching her from across the room. She looked at the clock on the wall. 10:03 a.m. She did the arithmetic. "In about 8 minutes," she said at conversational volume, "you're going to hear something outside. When you do, I'd put both hands flat on your desk and keep them there." She walked back to the bench. She sat down. She was done talking to him. Pruitt laughed, but it was shorter than his usual laugh, and it ended 3 beats too early, and he went back to his keyboard with slightly more force on the keys than he had been using before, the black notebook still open on the desk beside him. Webb drifted to the window. He told himself he was watching the street for no particular reason. He checked the street for no particular reason 3 times in 4 minutes. Tatum pulled up the property records again. This time he didn't stop at the 3rd line. He read to the bottom. He read the federal exemption code attached to the Carter Family Trust registration, a Class 7 designation he had seen exactly once before in 20 years, attached to the property records of a man who had turned out 6 months later to be a CIA station chief. He sat very still with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the code, and then looked across the room at the woman on the bench, and then looked back at the code. "Bryce," he said, and his voice came out with a carefulness that was new in it, the carefulness of a man who understands he is about to say something that cannot be unsaid, and is choosing to say it anyway. "The Carter Family Trust is registered under a Class 7 Federal Service exemption. I've only seen that classification once before." Pruitt did not look up from his keyboard. Dunn had stopped pretending to fill out her form. She was looking at Tatum, then at Vivian, then at the black notebook on Pruitt's desk. At 10:07, Tatum said more quietly, "Bryce, you need to look at this." Pruitt kept typing. At 10:09, Webb straightened at the window. When he spoke, his voice came out careful and strange, the voice of a man trying to report something calmly that is not calm. "Sarge." Nothing. "Sarge!" Louder. The sound arrived before the visual low and rhythmic, and felt in the sternum before it registered anywhere else the specific frequency of military rotors at low altitude pressing down through the ceiling of the building like a hand. The particular sound that, once you have heard it in a certain context, you do not confuse with anything else. Then the black SUVs, 4 of them rolling into the station parking lot in a tight formation that left no gaps and no exits, and no ambiguity whatsoever about what kind of authority they represented. Tatum slowly pushed back from his desk. Dunn set her pen down. Webb's hand dropped from the window frame. The fluorescent lights kept humming indifferent, the only thing in the room that hadn't changed. Pruitt looked up from his keyboard for the first time in 8 minutes. He looked at the parking lot. He looked at the black notebook open on his desk. He looked at Vivian. She was already looking at him. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not angry. It was the expression of someone watching an outcome they had calculated in advance arrive on schedule, the expression of a general watching a battle reach its conclusion. The front doors opened, not kicked in, simply opened, but opened with a velocity and purpose that changed the pressure in the room. The way a window thrown wide in a sealed space changes everything at once, irreversibly. 6 agents in tactical vests entered in a formation that was quiet and absolute, weapons, holstered hands visible, eyes moving across the room in the continuous sweep of people who have been trained to read a space and account for every variable in it within 4 seconds. They did not shout. They moved with the specific controlled efficiency that communicates more effectively than volume ever could that the situation has been reclassified. Behind them came Agent Diana Reyes' dark suit, no vest, carrying a leather folio that was visibly, unmistakably full, 3 inches thick, with the specific density of a file that has been built over months by someone who has been waiting a long time to use it. She moved into the room the way water moves into a low place completely and without waste. "Nobody leaves," she said at a volume that was perfectly conversational and somehow reached every corner of the station without effort. "Nobody calls out. Station communications are being rerouted." Then she walked directly to Vivian. A younger agent, moving behind Reyes and slightly to her left, saw Vivian first, looked at her face, looked at the way she was sitting, and stopped walking for approximately 1 second. Then he came to attention. Not dramatically, not the full snap of a formal ceremony, but the specific, involuntary straightening of a body that has been trained to respond to certain presences in a certain way, a response that bypassed the conscious mind entirely and operated somewhere older and more fundamental. The agent next to him noticed and did the same. Reyes said, not loudly, not performing it for the room, just stating a fact that happened to carry enormous weight. "General, are you injured?" "General." The word moved through the room like a current through water. It reached Tatum at his desk and his hands went still on the keyboard. It reached Dunn in her corner, and she set her pen down with a click that seemed very loud. It reached Webb at the window and his eyes closed briefly the way eyes close when something you already knew is confirmed. It reached Pruitt at his desk and his typing stopped mid-keystroke, his fingers hovering over the keys, not completing the word they were in the middle of forming, suspended there, while his brain attempted to process a reclassification of the last 2 hours that fundamentally changed the nature of every single decision he had made in them. A medic stepped forward without being asked and began documenting the handcuff marks on Vivian's wrists. The deep purple-black welts photographed from 6 angles, clinical and thorough, and completely, irrevocably on the record. The story stays on Pruitt now. Not on Vivian, who is being attended to by people who know exactly what they are doing and why. On Pruitt, on the specific, terrible real-time process of a man whose certainty has been the foundation of everything he has built for 22 years, understanding in the span of about 6 seconds that the foundation was wrong and that everything built on it is coming down, and that there is nothing, not the Union, not Mosley, not the photograph on the wall, not 2 decades of paperwork that is going to absorb what is about to happen. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The 2 most honest words anyone in that room had heard all morning. Reyes read the charges in the same flat, unhurried procedural tone that Dale Pruitt had used an hour earlier to list his charges against Vivian in her front yard. And the echo of that tone, the recognition that the instrument he had wielded so comfortably was being turned in the other direction with the same dispassionate efficiency, was something Pruitt felt in his body in a way he would not have been able to describe, but would not be able to stop feeling. Assault under color of law, unlawful detention, civil rights violation. Title, 18 Section 242. And because Reyes had 6 months of work behind her, and this morning had given her the predicate event she needed to activate it. Conspiracy with Councilman Earl Mosley to conduct a pattern of racially targeted enforcement against residents and business owners in the Millbrook Heights corridor and along Garrison Avenue over a period of not less than 6 years. Pruitt tried each defense in order: probable cause, trespassing complaint, failure to identify. Each one met with a quiet, documented response from Reyes, who had prepared for every door because this was not for her an improvisation. It was the conclusion of 6 months of patient, methodical work, and she had been ready for this exact conversation since the 3rd week of April. Reyes opened the folio. She found a specific page 3rd tab. Second document, the timestamp reading 9:53 a.m. The location data matching the booking area of the Millbrook Heights station. She read in full from Webb's body camera transcript. I've been the law in Millbrook Heights for 22 years, and in 22 years, I've never been wrong about who belongs and who doesn't. She closed the folio. You were wrong today, Sergeant Pruitt, she said, and we are going to spend the next several months establishing precisely how many other people you were wrong about and for how long. Then she picked up the small black notebook from Pruitt's desk, the one he had written in before he got out of the car, the one he had kept open beside his keyboard while composing the official report. She opened it. She read the 3 lines written there in his compressed handwriting. She looked at him. You wrote the report before you made the arrest, she said. Not a question, a notation. Pruitt looked at Webb. Webb met his eyes for 1 second, then looked at his boots where his gaze remained. He looked at Tatum. Tatum was looking at the window, his coffee cold and untouched, his hands flat on the desk in front of him. He looked for allies and found only people who had been afraid of him, and fear had never been loyalty, and the distance between those 2 things was the entire distance between who he had been this morning and who he was right now. And it turned out that distance was nothing at all. It was a single word spoken at conversational volume by a woman in a dark suit carrying a very full folder. The handcuffs went on him with the same practiced click he had used on Vivian, same model, same procedure applied with the same complete indifference to his comfort. Nobody commented on the symmetry. It did not need commentary. He was walked through the bullpen, past Tatum, past Dunn, past every officer in the station who had quietly reorganized themselves to the far side of the room. He passed the framed photograph above his desk. Officer of the Year, 2019, the wide smile the plaque held at chest height, the small American flag in the brass stand. He did not look at it. For the first time in 6 years, he could not look at it. Vivian stood. She pulled down the cuff of her sleeve over her bruised wrist with a deliberate, unhurried motion, not concealing the injury which existed now in federal evidence in 6 high-resolution photographs, but simply reclaiming the ordinary gesture of adjusting her own clothing, the small sovereignty of being a person in possession of herself. 2 agents moved toward the door. She paused near Pruitt, who was being held by two agents near the booking desk, not struggling the animation that had defined him for 22 years, switched off by the sheer magnitude of what had happened to him in the last 40 minutes. She stood approximately 4 feet from him. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anything. "You didn't arrest me because I didn't belong here," she said. "You arrested me because you needed me to believe that." One beat. There's a difference. She walked past him. She did not look back. Outside, the November light was thin and cold and absolutely clear. 3 black SUVs sat in formation, engines idling. Across the street, the helicopter had set down in the park, its rotors slowing to stillness. And on the sidewalk, very still, Biscuit's leash wrapped twice around her hand, her free palm pressed flat against her sternum, Carol Whitfield. She had been standing there since the first SUV arrived. She had watched the agents go in. She had watched the helicopter land. And now she watched Vivian come out through the front doors of the police station and watched the agents fall into formation around her and watched one of them say something low and respectful and watched Vivian respond with the ease of someone who had spent 34 years surrounded by people whose job was to protect her. Vivian looked at Carol, held her gaze for 3 full seconds, got in the SUV. Carol stood on the sidewalk for a long time after the convoy had gone. Biscuit sat at her feet and looked up at her, and she did not look down. At 11:20 a.m., federal agents executed warrants at Councilman Earl Mosley's office in the municipal building on Garrison Avenue. He was found at his shredder working through a stack of documents with the focused urgency of a man who understood that he had a very small window and was already out of time. The shredder was seized. The contents were partially reconstructible. They were entirely incriminating. Financial records subpoenaed from 3 accounts, including one registered to a shell company whose listed director was Pruitt's brother-in-law, showed 6 years of payments from Garrison Avenue business owners routed through fabricated municipal fine structures, assessed for violations that had never been real and would never have been enforced against anyone else on any other street. Reyes's 6-month file expanded from a single predicate event into a full federal investigation within 48 hours. 3 other officers in the Millbrook Heights Department were placed on administrative leave pending review. Marcus Webb submitted a voluntary statement at 2:15 p.m., a full account of everything he had witnessed every time he had said nothing. Every text he had partially seen on Pruitt's phone, every report he had watched being written before the arrest it described, and the specific moment that morning when he had adjusted his body camera angle instead of turning it off, and why, as best as he understood it, he had done that. The statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes to complete. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. It was the most important. Roy Tatum submitted his statement at 4 p.m. He named every complaint he had processed and quietly routed to Mosley's office. Every report he had accepted without question. Every time Pruitt's word had been taken as the end of the matter. He did not ask for anything in return. He did not lie about a single thing. He had been carrying it for 20 years, and it had gotten very heavy, and setting it down, even in the way he was setting it down in a federal affidavit in a room with a recorder running, felt underneath everything like something close to relief. The federal courthouse was built to communicate permanence, high ceilings. Mahogany benches worn smooth by decades of use, a federal seal behind the judge's position that served as a constant silent reminder that what happened in this room carried a weight that local institutions had long since stopped providing. Dale Pruitt at the defense table was a transformed man, and the transformation had nothing to do with anything that had happened to him externally. It was the transformation of a man whose context has been removed, without the uniform, without the badge, without the cruiser, and the 22 years of institutional backing he was occupying a space he had no idea how to fill. The authority had never been his. It had been borrowed from the institution, and the institution had taken it back, and what remained was a man in an ill-fitting suit who looked for the first time approximately his actual size. In the gallery, the Garrison Avenue business owners sat in the third and fourth rows, present quiet, with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting a long time for a room like this one. A dry cleaner named Robert, who had paid $4,800 over 3 years for fire code violations that had been invented. Sandra, who had run a hair salon on Garrison for 11 years and had been cited 11 times in the last 3 of them for fabricated infractions, each one resolved with a cash payment that went nowhere on any official ledger. A retired teacher named Mr. Aldridge, who had been arrested for loitering outside his own property in 2021 while waiting for a furniture delivery. The charge quietly dropped 4 months later after he had already paid a bail bondsman and lost a week of sleep. They did not speak. They watched. They had been waiting long enough that patience had become a practice. Webb testified first. The body camera footage played on the courtroom monitor. Pruitt's voice unhurried and self-assured, speaking the sentence that had been playing in Webb's head since the morning of the arrest. "I've been the law in Millbrook Heights for 22 years, and in 22 years, I've never been wrong about who belongs and who doesn't." The gallery went very still. It was the stillness of people hearing something they had known for a long time, finally said out loud, by the person responsible for it, finally on the record, finally permanent. Then the prosecution submitted the black notebook. Reyes read the 3 lines written before the arrest, the charges, the fabricated probable cause, the narrative pre-constructed before Pruitt had spoken a single word to the woman in the garden. She read them in the same flat procedural voice she used for everything, and the flatness of it made them land harder than outrage ever could have. Robert, in the third row, looked at his hands. Sandra pressed her lips together. Mr. Aldridge closed his eyes for a moment. The jury watched all 3 of them. She took the stand in full-dress uniform, the 4 stars on her shoulders, the rows of service ribbons across her left breast telling 34 years of a story to anyone who knew the language, and for the people in the room who didn't know it, explaining itself in the way that certain things explain themselves through sheer, accumulated weight. The defense attorney tried the only available approach, which was to suggest the situation might have resolved more simply with a different response from Vivian. "You had options," he said. "You could have identified yourself more directly. You could have prevented all of this." "I stated my name," she said. "I gave my address. I offered to produce documentation 3 separate times. The sergeant's response to each of those statements was to increase the application of physical force." She paused for exactly 1 beat. The identification he required was not a document. The attorney tried a different angle, asking whether a person of her experience and training shouldn't have understood that a police officer in a tense situation needed clear, unambiguous cooperation. She looked at him with a patience that was not kindness. "I was standing still in my own garden," she said. He moved on. She spoke about Robert and Sandra and Mr. Aldridge by name. She had studied their cases in the weeks before the trial. Their complaint, filings, their payment records, the specific language of each fabricated citation, the pattern of dates and amounts that told a story no individual instance could tell alone. She entered 3 files directly into the record. She spoke about each person as a person, not as a data point. Robert's business, which had been in his family for 2 generations. Sandra's salon, where she employed 4 people from the neighborhood. Mr. Aldridge's habit of sitting on his own front stoop on Sunday mornings with a cup of coffee, which had apparently constituted in Pruitt's accounting a threat to public order. The defense had no effective cross-examination. There is no good way to cross-examine 34 years of precision under pressure, and the attorney, to his credit, understood this quickly and sat down. The prosecutor returned to the podium for one final question. She asked Vivian to address Pruitt's recorded statement, the one about 22 years and never being wrong about who belonged. Vivian looked at Pruitt directly. He did not meet her eyes. "He was wrong about Robert," she said. "He was wrong about Sandra. He was wrong about Mr. Aldridge and every other person on Garrison Avenue who paid to be left alone.
He was wrong every time a complaint was quietly closed. She let the silence hold for a moment. He was wrong about me.
The only difference between my case and theirs is that mine had consequences. That gap between the people whose cases had consequences and the people whose cases were closed is exactly what this trial is about. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 9 minutes. They reviewed Webb's body camera footage twice. They asked to see the black notebook once more, specifically the 3 lines written before the arrest, the charges constructed before a single word had been exchanged. They were not seriously divided at any point. Guilty on all counts. Mosley guilty on conspiracy, racketeering, obstruction. 4 years federal. Full forfeiture of pension and all proceeds from 6 years of city contracts connected to the Garrison Avenue enforcement. Pruitt, 14 years federal. Permanent revocation of law enforcement certification in all 50 states. Full forfeiture of his 22-year pension, a portion directed toward restitution for Robert and Sandra and Mr. Aldridge and the others, for the money they had paid for violations that had never existed and should never have cost them anything. The judge spoke to the gallery rather than to Pruitt, and in doing so, she spoke to the people who had come to this courtroom from Garrison Avenue and had been waiting in one form or another for much longer than this trial had been running. The conduct in this case was not exceptional, she said. That is precisely what made it so destructive. It was ordinary. It was built from ordinary silence and ordinary fear, and ordinary moments when someone with the authority to stop something looked at the black notebook on the desk and kept typing the report. What ended it was not exceptional either. It was a woman who declined to be made smaller than she was, and a young officer who adjusted his camera instead of turning it off. She looked at Pruitt, then not with anger, with conclusion. Pruitt was led out in restraints. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at the photograph of himself that he would never see again. But the route to the holding door took him past the first row, and as he passed he saw it placed on the bench beside Vivian, quietly before the verdict was read, a single marigold yellow and slightly wilted cut that morning from a garden at 714 Birchwood Drive. He stopped walking for the length of one step. He understood. The door closed behind him. The garden at 714 Birchwood Drive in May was the kind of thing that made people slow down on the sidewalk without quite knowing why, not aggressively not demanding attention, but with the quiet pull of something that had come into its own and didn't need to announce it. Roses along the fence line, lavender in 3 long rows that released their smell into the morning air with every slight movement of the breeze. And along the entire border of the garden, hundreds of marigolds, golden orange and dense, and absolutely indifferent to the opinions of their environment, blooming with the specific stubborn abundance of things that have come through a hard winter and emerged on the other side more fully themselves than they were before it. Vivian was on her knees in the garden. Same canvas gloves worn thin at the fingertips, same Howard University hoodie. She was not thinking about Dale Pruitt, who was in a federal facility in Pennsylvania, and who occupied in her mental landscape approximately the same real estate as every other concluded operation accounted for, filed, no longer requiring her attention. She was thinking about something her mother had told her when she was 9 years old, kneeling in a garden very much like this one in Richmond, Virginia, about how marigolds bloom best after a hard frost. That the cold doesn't stop them. The cold is part of what makes them. Carol Whitfield came down the sidewalk from the north end of Birchwood, walking biscuit, moving with the careful pace of someone who has been thinking about the same thing for a long time and has finally decided that thinking about it is no longer sufficient. She had been attending Garrison Avenue community meetings for 4 months. She had not asked for forgiveness because she was not yet sure she had done enough to earn the right to ask. She stopped at the garden wall. She was carrying a small clay pot with a yellow rose in it. She set it on the wall without a word. Vivian looked at it, looked at Carol, nodded once. Carol nodded back. She turned and walked home. Not everything healed, not everything forgiven. but something had shifted quietly without ceremony, the way the most real changes happen, and the garden kept growing. She finished the last row of marigolds and sat back on her heels and looked at what she had made. Hundreds of things she had put into the ground and trusted the world to meet halfway. She had spent 34 years commanding forces and building strategy and protecting people who would never know her name. Briefing presidents at 3 in the morning and making decisions in 30-second windows that changed outcomes across distances she couldn't always measure. None of it, not the combat operations, not the Senate floor, not the 2 administrations she had served, had required more of her than sitting on a metal bench in a small police station, with her wrists bruised and her dignity completely intact, and waiting for the truth to catch up to what she already knew, which it always does eventually if you are patient enough and strong enough not to compromise it in the meantime. She thought about Robert and Sandra and Mr. Aldridge. She thought about the complaints that had been filed and quietly closed the people who had paid and gone home and told themselves this was simply how the world worked, because nobody had ever shown up to tell them otherwise. She thought about the gap the judge had named between the cases that had consequences and the cases that didn't, and she thought about how the work of closing that gap was not finished and would not be finished in her lifetime, but was worth doing anyway every single day with whatever you had. She pulled her gloves off, held her hands open in the morning air, feeling the cold and the warmth together, the way May balances itself, still deciding. She went inside to make coffee. There is something in this story that most of us recognize, not because we have been General Vivian Carter, though some of us have been close enough to know exactly what that morning felt like in our own bodies, but because we have all stood in a moment where someone decided before they knew a single thing about us that we were less than we were, that we didn't belong, that the space we occupied was theirs to grant or withdraw. Most of us made ourselves smaller. Most of us let it pass because the cost of not letting it pass felt too high, and because nobody had ever shown us what it looked like to stay exactly the size you are and wait for the truth to arrive. She didn't make herself smaller. She kept her hands visible and her back straight and her wrists bruised and her dignity intact, and she waited, and the truth arrived on schedule the way it always does when someone refuses to give it a reason to turn around. Not every general wears their stars where you can see them. Some of them are kneeling in a garden on a cold November morning, planting flowers that bloom where nothing else will, waiting patiently, completely without compromise for the world to catch up to what they already know about themselves. If this story meant something to you, if you saw something in it that you recognized, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment below. What would you have done in that garden? We read every single one.